We're going to talk about analyzing nonfiction texts. One of the things that you're going to need to do is discern the differences between the different kinds of informational texts that you're going to encounter. Specifically, we'll talk about some different genres that you're going to see on the STAAR test as a freshman. You might come across an expository text, which means it's nonfiction that's purely informational, a neutral tone, not trying to convince you of anything. Persuasive, which obviously is going to be about opinion, an argument that's being stated. Literary nonfiction, which feels like storytelling, could be a memoir, could be a personal essay. It has literary devices, but it's ultimately a true story. A procedural text, meaning like a how-to, something you probably did when you were in elementary school, but this is going to be kind of within the other genres, not something that stands on its own, as well as different kinds of media. This will be embedded within the other genres as well. So that means like looking at charts or graphs or pictures, things like that, that will help reinforce the main idea of the nonfiction text. Let's take a look at an example text from a released STAAR test from 2017. When you're taking a look at a piece of nonfiction, the first thing that you want to do, which probably is intuitive, is look at the title and look at other information provided about the author, the publication, all of that good stuff that will give you clues about what kind of nonfiction it is. The title of this text is How a Demon iPad Stole My Summer Vacation. It's by Doyle McManus of the Los Angeles Times, which is a newspaper. Okay, so you know that it's going to be a report, which is purely informational, a feature article, which is primarily informational, but will include some viewpoints from people that they interview and maybe a little bit of the viewpoint of the author of the article. Or it could be an editorial, which is an opinion piece, and it's meant to be persuasive. You can tell by the title alone that this is not a neutral piece. Look at the word choice, a demon iPad. That's meant to have some sort of comedic effect, but you can tell that there's an opinion embedded in the title alone. So like we talked about, we know from the title that this is going to be an opinion piece, an editorial. The word demon has an intense negative connotation, as you know, and so we can already infer that this author is trying to convince us that the iPad, for whatever reason, is not a good thing. That's going to be part of his argument. So let's take a look. Because it's an editorial, we're going to see different kinds of features in this text than you would in something that's purely informational. Notice the first sentence starts with the first person point of view. There's a little bit of storytelling going on in this editorial because that's part of his persuasive strategy. He's going to be talking about his personal experience. What you always want to do when you read a piece of nonfiction is try to figure out the main idea. We know from the title that it's going to be a critique of this iPad, but what specifically is he arguing and how is he supporting that argument? Like we talked about, we know that he's going to attempt to support his argument with personal experience. So find pieces of evidence from his life that supports his assertion, but that means we have to find the assertion in the first place. So obviously you want to read through the entire piece in order to figure out the ultimate argument. Take a look here. The Demon iPad in paragraph 11. It's a reference to the title, so you know it's going to be part of that argument. The Demon iPad beckoned silently from the picnic table. What harm could it be to give the email a quick check? But once that alluring touchscreen lights up, who can resist lingering? Okay, so he's implying that part of this problem with the iPad is that you get sucked into it. That's what we can see from this rhetorical question, lingering. I'm not the first to stumble across this problem, of course. I'm a late adopter, even when it comes to vices. Now, vices implies that it's this intense problem and addiction that people have. Look at this shift in language. It's no longer narrative. As early as 2008, Nicholas Carr, author of The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, was warning that broadband internet was reducing our attention spans and making us stupid. The web, he said, encourages us to lapse into our, quote, natural state of distractedness. Even before that, in the pre-broadband ice age of 2000, Harvard's Robert Putnam warned that television, and more broadly, staring into any kind of screen, had reduced the amount of time families spent in social interactions like, well, penny ante poker at the picnic table. So paragraphs 13 and 14 shift from his narrative voice. He's no longer storytelling his personal experience. He's bringing in outside sources to support his argument. that technology interferes with your social life and your ability to interact with other people. So we can tell this is still a piece of nonfiction despite some narrative structure happening early on. That was simply a rhetorical strategy. Okay? He brings in other pieces of evidence in order to support his argument. And here we go. Here's a good phrase that indicates this must be part of his argument. That's the point. He says it straight out. It's important not to let the convenience of the internet get in the way of simpler beauties. This sentence alone, we could isolate and say this is his argument. He literally tells us that's the point. Okay, so look for key phrases like that in an article that's trying to convince you of a certain opinion. Sometimes they'll come out and tell you, this is what I want you to believe. Being able to discern their thesis statement and being able to find the way that they support this thesis is going to be the best way for you to interpret a piece of nonfiction. This is another example of a text that appeared on this same STAAR test. It is called The Low-Tech Appeal of Little Free Libraries. From the title alone, you might have already inferred that this is a piece of nonfiction, at the very least. This doesn't seem like it would be the title of a narrative piece, right? It comes across as informational. If you take a look at the other features of the author, the publication says it's by Margaret Aldrich from The Atlantic. If you didn't know, The Atlantic is a magazine that talks about contemporary cultural issues. You're not expected to know every single publication that the STAAR test references, but they can sometimes give you clues about what kind of thing you're about to be reading. But what if you can't tell? What you can do is observe the features of the text and determine what you notice in order to figure out what genre of nonfiction you're working with. Because if you can determine if you're working with expository or persuasive, then you're going to have a better idea of what kinds of information you're going to be getting from the text, how you'll locate the main idea, and supporting details. Okay, so we need to really figure out if this is really informational or if there's going to be an opinion embedded in the text. If you take a look at the title, it does say there's an appeal of free libraries, so there does seem to be a little bit of an opinion in the title itself, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're working with an editorial, right? The title of the previous text that we looked at was a lot clearer as far as the fact that it was an opinion. What are some other things we notice? We can see that there are photos used. If you take a look here, when a 36-year-old bibliophile in Daegu, South Korea sat down at his computer and Googled the word library, he didn't expect to find anything particularly noteworthy. But as Do Sun-yu scrolled through the results, an appealingly anti-tech concept popped up. So there are some specific details as this article opens that indicate we're dealing with a real person and a real story. And so we don't really see any specific embedded opinions yet, like we did off the bat in our previous text. Down here in paragraph 3, we also have a quotation from an interview with Do Sun. So the features that we're noticing so far are more indicative of a feature article. It's not dry and completely informational. There are some storytelling elements involved. We're talking about a particular person highlighting his experience to illustrate what this title is saying, the low-tech appeal of little free libraries. A feature article is going to bring in interviews and other outside sources to kind of paint a picture of a story of interest to their audience. So we've determined we're taking a look at a feature article. One of the things that I'm going to suggest to you is to focus on the common thread of the storytelling in order to get an idea as to what the main purpose is of this interest piece. So obviously we're focusing on what little free libraries are, and it sounds like the way that this article begins is kind of an origin story. So as we proceed through the text, you're going to notice some markers to give you a hint at the organizational pattern. It transitions, and it seems like it transitions in a chronological sense and across different times and spaces. So it's talking about South Korea, it talks about Wisconsin, and the expansion of what these libraries have to offer. It says at the bottom of paragraph 6, I think little free libraries open the door to conversations we want to have with each other. This quote supports the idea that little free libraries have appeal. Appeal means like the good things, what makes an item of interest attractive to a group of people. as you continue down, one thing to focus on in particular with nonfiction is how the main idea is reinforced near the end of the article. So paying close attention to this last paragraph is going to help give us an idea of what the author really wants to reinforce. A girl walking home from school might pick up a graphic novel that gets her excited about reading. A man on his way to the bus stop might find a volume of poetry that changes his outlook on life. Every book is a potential source of inspiration. So again, that reinforces the appeal of the little free library. Take a look at the graphic that's included. It reinforces the appeal as well. This graphic is entitled Little Free Libraries Make a Difference Across Texas. And it has different cities across the state with some information, some dates that explains the positive impact that little free libraries have had on the state and for how long. Graphic features included in these nonfiction texts are often going to help support the main idea. We're going to take a look at one more example from this test. It's called Hunger for Books by Scott Russell Sanders. Something we've talked about with the other texts is the first thing that you want to do is take a look at the features that give you hints about what kind of text it is, what genre, fiction or nonfiction, and then those subgenres within those bigger categories. So if we take a look here, all we're given is a title and an author, not a particular kind of publication, which leads me to believe that it's not necessarily from a magazine or a newspaper. So what could that mean? Oftentimes when you're given something that's fiction, it's just presented in this way. So that's something to consider. If we take a look at paragraph 1, it begins in the first person. Now that doesn't mean that it has to be fiction if it begins in the first person, because if you remember, the editorial that we looked at also used first-person narration as a rhetorical strategy for nonfiction persuasive, but it is something to notice. I visited the library once a week, first with my mother, and then when Sandra learned to drive, with my sister, and eventually on my own. Something else we notice in paragraph 2 is the language here. Curious, I drew out a shiny volume, opened it gingerly, heard the stiff spine creak, ran my fingers over the unblemished pages, lowered my nose to smell the fresh glue and ink. This is imagery. Imagery is sensory language. This author is clearly using descriptive language, evoking the 5 senses. So this is a literary device. The voice that the author is using is narrative and descriptive, which feels like fiction, again, right? Take a look here in paragraph 3. All these years later, after making more than 20 books of my own, I still feel the miraculous power in language, whether written or spoken. The same power I felt when I sang a train into motion, when I learned the name of snake, and Sandra taught me the alphabet, etc. This transition from paragraph 2 gives some specific details about the author's experience. We now know that the first person isn't a character. It's Scott Russell Sanders, who wrote Hunger for Books. It's talking about his experience as an author. So we know, because these facts are included, his 20 books of publication after many years, that this is a personal essay. It's like literary nonfiction. Okay, so the difference between fiction and literary nonfiction is that in literary nonfiction, obviously, we're dealing with truth. It might be embellished with literary devices, and it's told maybe with a similar voice as fiction, but there's going to be some sort of message that's not thematic in the same way a piece of fiction would be. There's maybe going to be more clarity as far as what we're supposed to get out of this author's perspective. If we look a little bit closer, one thing that you should notice, because it is literary nonfiction, is ideas that come up again and again, right? In nonfiction, authors often reinforce their message by repeating ideas in a clear way. You can see here in paragraph 4 that the author talks about using the library. That was something that he already introduced in the first paragraph. I recognize that my childhood library in Ohio, which seems so enormous, was actually quite small. Reading the books I found there, I went on adventures, I dived under the sea and climbed mountains. I met explorers and baseball players and scientists. I learned the names of rocks and birds and butterflies and so on. This sentence continues for the rest of the paragraph. You'll notice that each of these clauses separated with semicolons. it builds and builds and builds. And he's really reinforcing here just how much, the sheer volume of interesting things that he learned from a library. That reinforces that title, the hunger for books, right? He's trying to emphasize just how beautiful a library can be, how beautiful books are to him. And we see that even through his syntax here, just the volume, the weight of all these wonderful things he took away from his reading experience. He continues on discussing libraries. A library is a storehouse, preserving what humans have learned generation by generation in every land. But it is a storehouse with doors and windows and hallways opening outward to the vast, sprawling, worldwide treasure trove of human knowledge. If you take a look at this language here, it's beautiful. It's very narrative. It's not dry informational. It is his personal experience. And you can see how loving he is, a treasure trove. He's very intentional about his language to show how much he cherishes reading and his experience in the library. Another thing that we have reinforced as well with nonfiction is to look very closely at the way an author wraps up the end. If you're writing a STAAR essay, you're reinforcing your thesis in your conclusion. That's something many other authors do in a work of nonfiction. So paying close attention to that ending is helpful to you if you're still wondering, well, what is the point? As you can see here in paragraph 7, he says, I'm not foolish enough to believe that books will survive merely because I love them or because I write them or because they've shaped my life. By comparison with films or videos or computer bulletin boards, a good book requires more from us in the way of intelligence and imagination and memory. And that makes it vulnerable to its glitzy competitors, right? His glitzy competitors, that's referring to paragraph 6, where he's talking about the appeal of computers and technology and how some people prefer that over reading a traditional book. But he reinforces here just how important it is to read and how he hopes that books stick around forever, right? As long as there are people hungry for such understanding, there will be people hungry for books, which again is this motif. It's reinforcing his title. So you know that's going to be part of his main idea. To wrap up, some things that we've talked about when you're reading nonfiction, after you discern what organizational structure this nonfiction text has, these are some things to focus on in general. The first and last paragraphs deserve your special attention because just as you as a writer would do this, authors of nonfiction often reinforce important messages and arguments in their first and last paragraphs. Not always, but often. So pay close attention to those places. Repeated ideas. Any good nonfiction writer who's trying to really honestly deliver information or enforce an argument is going to repeat ideas that are significant and convincing or just contribute in a way that really helps the reader make sense of their main idea. So look for repeated ideas, specific words, phrases, concepts. Quoted information. Why did the author choose to include a quotation from an interview or a quotation from another source? Often these are supporting details that reinforce the main idea. And finally, graphics. They're there again to be supporting pieces of information that help reinforce that main idea. And ultimately, that is what you want to do when you read a piece of nonfiction. You want to get the big picture. What are they really talking about? And you want to understand how they support their argument so you can evaluate in the future whether something is credible or not. That's the next level. Happy reading!